The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic, the kind of warmth that promised a home, a family, a life well lived. Susan Harper stood at the counter, her hands steady as she sliced carrots, the knife gliding through with a rhythm born of years. Outside, the Ohio dusk painted the small town of Willow Creek in hues of amber and gray, the kind of quiet beauty that made you forget how fast a heart could break. The dining room glowed behind her, crystal glasses catching the chandelier's light, jazz notes drifting from a speaker David had set up for the evening. It was perfect, wasn't it? The house she'd paid for, the table she'd set, the life she'd built. But perfection, Susan was about to learn, was just a mask for something sharper. She wiped her hands on the apron, the one with faded sunflowers she'd worn since David was a boy, and carried a platter of roast chicken to the dining room. Laughter spilled from the table. David's voice, bright and careless, mingling with Lauren's, his wife, whose every word seemed polished for an audience. Lauren's parents, the Coopers, sat across from them, their faces flushed with wine and self-assurance. Susan had rushed home from the grocery store when David texted her that morning. "Lauren forgot to tell you, her folks are coming for dinner. Can you make it nice?" She always made it nice. She always did. Susan set the platter down, her smile practiced, invisible. She was about to slip back to the kitchen when Mrs. Cooper's voice cut through the chatter. "And you are?" The question hung in the air, curious but edged, like a blade wrapped in silk. Susan froze, her hand still on the platter. Lauren laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, that's Susan," she said, waving a manicured hand. "Our unofficial maid. Keeps the house running." The table erupted in laughter. Mrs. Cooper's high-pitched chuckle, Mr. Cooper's low rumble, and worst of all, David's soft huff, as if it were the cleverest thing he'd ever heard. The room spun. Susan's chest tightened, her breath caught somewhere. A servant in her own home, reduced to a punchline. She forced a smile, the kind that hid a scream, and excused herself, muttering something about more wine. In the kitchen, she set the empty bottle on the counter, her hands trembling. Behind her, the laughter continued, louder now, as if she'd never been there. Not one of them, not David, not her own son, corrected Lauren. Not one of them said, "That's my mother." The floor seemed to vanish beneath her, but Susan didn't cry. Not yet. She walked to her bedroom, the one she'd painted sage green when they first moved in, when David was fresh out of college and dreaming big. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door she'd hung herself, her name on the mortgage papers, her savings drained for the down payment. She'd given everything. Her career, her youth, her heart, and now, she was nothing. The maid, the help, the invisible woman who made their lives shine. If the story's hitting you, if you've ever felt unseen in your own life, stick with me. Subscribe to the channel, share your story in the comments, and let's build a community where no one's invisible. I'm Susan, and this is where my story begins. Not with tears, but with a choice. That night, Susan didn't sleep. She sat up, the house silent except for the occasional creak of floorboards, as if it knew her pain. She thought of the day she signed for this house, David's proud grin as he walked through the empty rooms, promising to make her proud. She thought of the years after her ex-husband left, the motel rooms she cleaned at midnight, the grocery shifts at dawn, all to keep a roof over David's head. When her parents passed, their insurance money went straight to this house. No rent, no bills, just love. And now, love had laughed in her face. By morning, Susan moved like a ghost. She brewed coffee, fed the cat Lauren pretended to adore, and waited. Lauren swept downstairs in her yoga gear, phone glued to her hand, not even a glance. Susan stood by the counter, the weight of the night pressing against her ribs. When Lauren finally looked up, Susan held out the keys, front door, back, garage, mailbox. Lauren blinked, her brow furrowing. "What's this?" Susan smiled, calm as a still lake. "Good luck paying the mortgage." Lauren's mouth opened, then closed. "What?" Susan didn't repeat herself. She walked past the framed photos she'd hung, the furniture she'd chosen, the walls she'd painted. She took only her purse and the coat she'd worn when she brought David home from the hospital, its wool fraying at the cuffs. David called her name as she reached the door, his voice sharp with confusion. She didn't stop. He ran after her, barefoot in the driveway, but Susan kept walking, her steps steady, deliberate. She didn't slam the car door. She closed it softly because this wasn't rage. It was something quieter, something deadly. Clarity. In the rearview mirror, David stood frozen, his face a mix of shock and something else. Maybe regret, maybe fear. He didn't know what he'd lost, and neither did she, not yet. Susan drove, the town blurring past. Main Street's quaint shops, the diner where she'd taken David for pancakes, the park where he'd learned to ride a bike. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew where she wasn't staying. The apartment her great-aunt Ellen had left her sat on the edge of Willow Creek, a sagging building with peeling paint and a heater that groaned like it was begging for retirement. Susan dropped her bag on the kitchen table, the air thick with the scent of old wood and time. The silence wasn't freedom, not yet. It was heavy, like dust settling over a life she didn't recognize. She stood there, staring at the chipped tiles, and for the first time in years, she didn't know what to do. So she did nothing. Not crying, not laughing, just standing, as if waiting for the woman she used to be to walk through the door. The apartment was a relic, a forgotten corner of Willow Creek where time seemed to have stopped. Susan stood in the kitchen, her purse still slung over her shoulder, the silence so thick it felt like a presence. The air carried the musty scent of old floorboards and mothballs, mingling with something fainter, like lavender from a life long gone. The walls, yellowed wallpaper curling at the seams, seemed to whisper of her great-aunt Ellen, a woman Susan barely knew but whose shadow now held her. She dropped her bag on the table, its thud echoing, and let her eyes wander. A cracked teapot on the counter. A calendar stuck on June 1995. A single chair by the window, its cushions sagging as if waiting for someone who never came back. This was her refuge now, a place as broken as she felt. Susan didn't unpack. She didn't know how to start. Instead, she moved through the apartment like a stranger, her fingers brushing over surfaces, stirring dust that danced in the slanted light of late autumn. The living room was small, cluttered with relics of Ellen's life. A sewing machine rusted at the edges, a stack of Reader's Digest magazines, a faded quilt draped over a couch that smelled of time. She sat there, the springs creaking under her weight, and stared out the window. Willow Creek stretched beyond, its main street lined with maple trees shedding red and gold leaves, a postcard of small-town America that hid its judgments behind white picket fences. She wondered if anyone out there noticed she was gone. The first night was the hardest. Susan slept on the couch, too weary to fix the broken bed frame in the bedroom. She ate a peanut butter sandwich, the bread stale from a corner store run, and drank water from a chipped mug. Her phone stayed silent. No texts from David, no calls from Lauren. Not even a whisper from the life she'd left behind. She thought of the dinner, the laughter, the way David's eyes slid past her, as if she were a fixture, not a person. She'd raised him alone. After his father walked out, her dreams of art school traded for night shifts and coupon clipping. Every cent of her parents' insurance money went to that house, to give David a home. And yet, in Lauren's world, Susan was nothing but the help. She didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because the grief was too deep, too vast, like an ocean she didn't know how to swim. Instead, she found an old spiral notebook in a drawer, its pages yellowed, the kind she used to buy for David's school projects. She sat at the kitchen table, the heater groaning in the background, and wrote. I waited for him to say thank you. I waited for him to see me. I waited, and I disappeared. The words spilled out, raw and unpolished, not for anyone else, just for her. She wrote about the nights she cried in the garage, about the dinners Lauren and David went to without her, about the TV shows they mocked while she pretended to sleep. Each sentence was a release, a crack in the dam she'd built around her heart. The next morning, Susan woke to the sound of rain tapping the window, a soft rhythm that felt like permission to stay still. She made coffee, the instant kind Ellen had left in a tin, and stood by the sink, watching the town blur through the downpour. She was about to turn away when a knock came at the door. sharp and unexpected. Susan hesitated, her pulse quickening. David? Lauren? But when she opened the door, a woman stood there, maybe 70, with silver hair pulled into a loose bun and a smile that crinkled her eyes. "You must be Susan," the woman said, holding out a plate of oatmeal cookies wrapped in plastic. "I'm Clara from 3B. Saw you move in yesterday. Thought you might need a little welcome." Susan blinked, caught off guard by the kindness. "Oh, thank you," she said, taking the plate, her voice rusty from disuse. Clara tilted her head, studying her. "Rough week, huh?" Susan managed a small laugh, surprised by how easily it came. "You could say that." Clara didn't push, just nodded. "This place has a way of holding you together when you're falling apart. Ellen was like that, too. Come by if you need a chat. I make a mean cup of tea." She winked and shuffled back down the hall, leaving Susan with the cookies and a flicker of warmth she hadn't expected. That encounter stayed with her, a tiny anchor in the storm. Later that day, Susan ventured upstairs, looking for a light bulb in the storage closet. The air was colder there, the floorboards creaking under her steps. She found a box of bulbs, but her eyes caught on something else. A heavy metal trunk tucked under a pile of fabric scraps, its lock rusted but loose. Curiosity pulled her closer. She pried it open, expecting sewing supplies or old letters. Instead, she found envelopes, dozens of them, tied with twine. One stood out, addressed to her in Ellen's spidery handwriting, dated 30 years ago. "If you're reading this, it means you've come back, and I'm sorry you had to." Susan's heart pounded. She sank to the floor, the trunk open before her, and unfolded the letter. Ellen's words were careful, deliberate. She'd been a nurse at Willow Creek General, working the night Susan gave birth. There'd been a mix-up, a last-minute room switch, a confusion with the tags. Ellen had raised concerns, but the hospital brushed them off. Years later, she found a document in her files. A quiet settlement to another family, the Mitchells. Susan's breath caught as she read the name, Ryan Mitchell. A photograph slipped from the envelope, a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket, labeled Michael Jameson, Ryan Mitchell, not David. She read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling. Hospital forms, notes, a DNA report Ellen had ordered in secret. It was true. David wasn't her son. Ryan was. Her real son had grown up just miles away, in the same town with a family that wasn't hers. Susan pressed the photo to her chest, her mind reeling. She didn't feel anger, not yet. She felt something else, freedom, sharp and terrifying. The coldness she'd always sensed from David, the distance that grew no matter how much she gave. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't imagined. Maybe he'd always felt like a stranger because he was. Susan sat there until the light faded, the rain still falling outside. The trunk held more affidavits, a small article about the Mitchells, successful and local. She folded the letter back, placed it in a new envelope, and tucked it into her nightstand. Then she looked in the mirror, her reflection a stranger's. The woman staring back was broken, yes, but she was waking up. And Willow Creek had no idea what that meant. If you're feeling Susan's story, if you've ever uncovered a truth that changed everything, join us. Subscribe to the channel, drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's share the journey. Because no truth stays buried forever. The leaves fell in slow spirals outside the window of Ellen's apartment, painting Willow Creek in a fleeting blaze of red and gold. Susan sat at the kitchen table, the spiral notebook open before her, its pages now half filled with truths she'd never dared speak aloud. The weight of Ellen's letter, tucked safely in her nightstand, pressed against her mind like a stone. Ryan Mitchell, her son. Not David, the boy she'd raised, the man who'd let her fade into the background of his life. She closed the notebook, her fingers lingering on its worn cover, and made a decision. She couldn't stay in this apartment forever, hiding from the world. She needed to see him. The walk to Main Street was brisk, the November air sharp against her cheeks. Willow Creek buzzed quietly, its shops adorned with harvest displays, pumpkins and hay bales framing doorways. Susan passed the diner where locals swapped gossip over coffee, their eyes flicking toward her, curious but distant. She'd always been David's mom, the woman who kept the house on Maple Lane spotless, the one who never complained. Now she was a ghost, a stranger in her own town. The thought stung, but it also fueled her steps toward Mitchell's Books, a green-painted storefront nestled between a bakery and a hardware store. The bell above the door chimed as Susan stepped inside, the scent of old paper and fresh coffee wrapping around her like a warm blanket. The bookstore was a haven, its shelves lined with novels and memoirs, handwritten signs recommending hidden gems. A few customers browsed, their voices soft, while a young woman with a braid rang up a purchase at the counter. And there he was, Ryan Mitchell, restocking a display of poetry books, his glasses slipping down his nose. He was about 30, clean-cut, with a quiet confidence that made Susan's heart ache. He didn't look like her, not exactly, but there was something in his posture, the way he tilted his head, that felt like a mirror. Susan lingered by a shelf, pretending to browse, her hands trembling as she picked up a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Ryan glanced over, offering a polite smile. "Good choice," he said, his voice warm, unhurried. "Hard to find a first edition like that these days." Susan nodded, her throat tight. "I've always loved it," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, adjusting his glasses. "Me too. Scouts got a way of sticking with you." They talked for a moment, about books, about the rain that hadn't stopped all week, and Susan felt something she hadn't in years. Seen. Not as a mother, not as a maid, but as a person. She left the bookstore with the novel, Ryan's smile lingering in her mind. Over the next few days, she returned, each visit a small act of courage. They talked about everything and nothing, classic literature, the best coffee in town, the way Willow Creek's festivals always drew the same crowds. Ryan was kind, patient, the kind of man who listened when you spoke. Each conversation chipped away at the wall Susan had built around her heart. But she didn't tell him the truth. Not yet. The weight of Ellen's letter was too heavy, too raw. Back in the apartment, Susan's nights took on a new purpose. She'd bought a second-hand laptop, its keys clacking as she dug into Lauren's world. Lauren Elevate LLC, her so-called lifestyle coaching empire, was everywhere online. Polished Instagram posts, motivational quotes, photos of Lauren in rented lofts she passed off as her own. But Susan saw through the cracks. She searched public records, business filings, even reviews on obscure forums. The truth was ugly. Forged invoices, fake client testimonials, a trail of unpaid bills. Lauren's empire was a house of cards, built on debt and deception. Susan printed everything, her hands steady as she organized the evidence. She wasn't just grieving anymore. She was planning. One evening, as she sipped tea Clara had dropped off, Susan's phone buzzed. A text from David. "Mom, are you okay?" 3 weeks of silence, and that was all he had. She stared at the screen, her heart twisting. Part of her wanted to reply, to pour out the hurt, the betrayal, the truth about Ryan. But another part, the part that had walked away from Maple Lane, knew better. David hadn't cared when Lauren laughed, when the Coopers clinked their glasses, when Susan's world crumbled. She set the phone down, unanswered, and wrote in her notebook instead. "He doesn't get to decide when I matter." The next morning, Susan was at the bookstore again, helping Ryan unpack a shipment of memoirs. He handed her a book about grief and forgiveness, his eyes thoughtful. "You might like this," he said. "It's heavy, but it's honest." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Honest. That was what she craved, what she'd lost in the house on Maple Lane. As they worked, their hands brushing over paperbacks, Susan felt a connection, fragile but real. She didn't need Ryan to call her mom. She just needed this quiet, this kindness. But peace never lasts in Willow Creek. That afternoon, Susan found a letter slipped under her apartment door, the law firm's logo stark against the white envelope. Her stomach dropped as she tore it open. Lauren was suing her for unlawful interference in her business, claiming Susan had sent defamatory documents to her parents. The words blurred on the page: cease and desist, damages, court. Susan's hands shook, not with fear, but with fury. Lauren wasn't just fighting back. She was escalating. By evening, the blow landed. Susan's phone buzzed with notifications, friends and neighbors tagging her in a post on Willow Creek's community Facebook group. Lauren's words were venomous, her profile picture smiling as she wrote, "Some people hide behind kindness, but the truth always comes out. Ask Susan Harper about her mistakes in the 90s. Families were hurt, and she's still playing the victim." Attached was a grainy photo, a younger Susan with a man who wasn't her ex-husband, their hands touching in a bar. The comments exploded: shock, judgment, whispers of scandal. Susan's past, a brief, shameful fling she'd buried to protect David, was now a weapon in Lauren's hands. Susan stood in the apartment, the letter crumpled in her fist, the phone glowing with accusations. Willow Creek was watching, waiting for her to break. She thought of Ryan, of the bookstore, of the woman she was becoming. Lauren thought she could bury her, but Susan wasn't the maid anymore. She was something else, something stronger. And this fight was just beginning. If you're with Susan, if you've ever faced a truth that threatened to break you, join us. Subscribe to the channel, share your story in the comments, and let's stand together. Because the truth doesn't just hurt, it sets you free. The apartment felt colder that night, the November wind rattling the windows of Ellen's old place like a warning. Susan sat at the kitchen table, the crumpled lawyer's letter and her glowing phone casting shadows across the chipped tiles. Lauren's Facebook post burned in her mind. Those venomous words, that grainy photo from a life Susan had buried long ago. A mistake, a fleeting moment of weakness when David was just a toddler, when loneliness had driven her into the arms of a married man. She'd ended it quickly, ashamed, vowing to be better for her son. But now, Willow Creek was dissecting her past, their comments piling up like stones. Hypocrite, no wonder David moved on. Some mother. Susan's hands trembled, not with fear, but with a fire she hadn't known she possessed. Lauren thought she could break her. She was wrong. Susan stood, pacing the small living room, the quilt on Ellen's couch brushing her fingertips. She needed air, perspective, someone to remind her she wasn't alone. Clara's face came to mind, those crinkled eyes, that plate of oatmeal cookies. Susan grabbed her coat and knocked on 3BS door, the hallway dim and smelling of mildew. Clara opened it, her silver hair loose, a mug of tea in her hand. "Susan," she said, her smile softening. "Come in, you look like you've seen a ghost." The warmth of Clara's apartment was a balm, crocheted blankets, a shelf of mystery novels, a radio humming soft jazz. Susan sank into a chair, the story spilling out. Lauren's post, the lawsuit, the town's judgment. Clara listened, her face steady, no pity, just understanding. When Susan finished, Clara leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "I was married once to a man who made me feel small. When I left, this town called me every name in the book. But you know what? I didn't hide. I looked them in the eye and kept going. You've got that strength, Susan. Don't let that girl's lies steal it." Susan's eyes stung, but she nodded. Clara's words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Clara sipped her tea, thoughtful. "Own your story before they can twist it. Tell the truth your way. This town's got a heart, but it needs reminding." Susan left Clara's apartment with a plan, her steps lighter, the fire in her chest burning brighter. Back at her table, Susan opened her laptop, the cursor blinking like a challenge. She wrote, her fingers flying, each word a reclamation. "I'm Susan Harper, and I'm not perfect. 30 years ago, I made a mistake. I was young, alone, raising a son with no one to lean on. I hurt people, and I've spent my life making up for it. Through love, through sacrifice, through building a home I thought was mine. But that home became a prison, and the people I loved laughed while I faded. Now I'm standing up, not just for me, but for every woman who's been called less than she is." She posted it to the Willow Creek community group, her heart pounding, and shut the laptop. The silence was deafening, but it was hers. By morning, Susan's phone was alive with notifications. She braced herself, expecting venom, but found something else. Messages from women she barely knew, neighbors, old coworkers, strangers. Thank you for saying it. I've been there. You're not alone. The comments on her post outnumbered Lauren's, drowning out the hate with stories of resilience, of survival. Willow Creek was listening, and for the first time, Susan felt its heart. She carried that strength to Mitchell's books, the bell chiming as she stepped inside. Ryan was behind the counter, helping a customer with a stack of novels, his smile as warm as ever. The bookstore was busier today, locals browsing for holiday gifts, the air humming with chatter. Susan lingered by the memoir section, her fingers tracing book spines, her mind replaying Clara's words. Ryan caught her eye, waving her over. Back again, he said, his tone teasing but kind. You're gonna need a loyalty card soon. Susan laughed, the sound surprising her. They talked about a new arrival, a book on second chances, and Susan felt the fragile thread between them grow stronger. But then Ryan's expression shifted, a flicker of curiosity. You come here a lot, he said, not unkindly. What's the real reason? Susan's breath caught. The truth, Ellen's letter, the hospital mix-up, hovered on her tongue, but she wasn't ready. I just like it here, she said, her voice steady. It feels honest. Ryan studied her, then nodded, letting it go. But the question lingered, a crack in their ease, and Susan left the bookstore with a pang of fear. What if he pulled away before she could tell him? That fear was buried by a storm brewing elsewhere. David had been silent since his text, but Susan's article about Lauren's fraudulent business had reached him, and with it, the weight of Ellen's letter. He'd done his own DNA test, the results confirming what Susan already knew. He wasn't her son. The truth unraveled him, stripping away the life he'd taken for granted. In his desperation, David searched for Ryan Mitchell, piecing together whispers from Willow Creek's gossip mill. Susan was spending time at the bookstore. Susan was different. Susan had another son. The collision came on a Thursday, the bookstore crowded with evening shoppers. Susan was home, unaware, when David stormed into Mitchell's books, his face haggard, eyes wild. Ryan was shelving books, startled as David approached, his voice loud enough to turn heads. You're Ryan, right? Susan's real son. The words cut through the store like a blade. Customers froze, their murmurs rising. Ryan set down a book, his jaw tight. Who are you? He asked, but David didn't stop. She told me everything. The hospital, the switch. You're living the life I was supposed to have. And now you're taking her, too. Ryan's face paled, confusion giving way to anger. You're David, he said, stepping forward. The guy who let his wife call her a maid. You don't get to come in here and act like you're the victim. The argument escalated, voices rising, accusations flying. David shoved a display, books tumbling, while Ryan stood his ground, defending a woman he barely knew but already respected. A customer pulled out a phone, recording the video, capturing every word, every gesture. By the time Ryan asked David to leave, the damage was done. The clip hit Willow Creek's social media within hours, the town ablaze with the story of a hospital mix-up, a mother betrayed, and two sons at war. Susan's phone buzzed that night, Clara's name on the screen. You need to see this, Clara said, her voice urgent. Susan opened the link, her heart sinking as she watched David and Ryan's confrontation, the comments already spiraling. Is this true? Susan's son isn't her son? What kind of mother does this? The truth she'd guarded was out, raw and public, and Susan felt the ground shift beneath her. She thought of Ryan, his confusion, his trust shaken. She thought of David, unraveling, lost. And she thought of herself, caught in a storm she'd started but couldn't control. Willow Creek was watching, and this time hiding wasn't an option. The rain had stopped, leaving Willow Creek draped in a crisp November mist that clung to the streets like a memory. Susan stood in Ellen's apartment, her hands wrapped around a mug of Clara's chamomile tea, the steam curling upward as she stared at her laptop. The video of David and Ryan's confrontation at Mitchell's books played on a loop in her mind. David's desperate accusations, Ryan's steady defense, the camera capturing every raw word. Willow Creek was buzzing, The community group flooded with speculation about the hospital mix-up, about Susan, about the sons who weren't hers and the one who was. She'd wanted the truth to breathe, but now it was a wildfire, and she was at its center. Hiding wasn't an option anymore. Susan set the mug down, her resolve hardening. It was time to take back her story. She called Ryan that morning, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "Can we talk?" she asked, the words heavy with everything she hadn't said. He hesitated, his tone cautious. "Sure. At the bookstore before we open." Susan hung up, her heart pounding. The truth about Ryan, about her real son, had been a weight she carried alone, but today, she'd lay it bare. She pulled Ellen's letter from the nightstand, its edges worn from her touch, and tucked it into her coat pocket. The walk to Main Street felt longer than usual, the town's familiar storefronts blurred by her thoughts. Maple trees shed their last leaves, carpeting the sidewalk in crimson. A reminder that endings could be beautiful, too. Mitchell's Books was quiet, the closed sign still on the door, the morning light filtering through tall windows. Ryan let her in, his glasses fogged from the cold, his expression guarded but kind. The bookstore smelled of cedar and ink, its shelves a sanctuary Susan had come to love. They sat in the back, in a small break room with a chipped table and a kettle humming softly. Susan's hands trembled as she pulled out the envelope, setting it between them. "There's something you need to know," she said, her voice breaking the silence like a stone in still water. Ryan's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. Susan took a breath, the words spilling out. Ellen's letter, the hospital mix-up, the night 2 babies were switched. She told him about David, the son she'd raised, the son who'd let her fade. She told him about the DNA test, the settlement, the photograph of a newborn labeled Ryan Mitchell. Her voice cracked as she finished. "You're my son, Ryan. Not by choice, not by chance, but by blood. I didn't come here to take anything from you. I needed you to know." Ryan stared at the envelope, his fingers resting on its edge, his face unreadable. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of a life rewritten. "This is a lot," he said finally, his voice low, careful. "I have parents. They raised me, loved me. I don't know what to do with this." Susan nodded, her eyes stinging. "You don't have to do anything," she said. "I'm not asking you to call me Mom. I just wanted the truth to be yours, too." He looked at her then, his gaze searching, and something softened. "You didn't have to come," he said. "But you did." Susan smiled, fragile but real. "I didn't know how not to." They sat in that small room, surrounded by the hum of the bookstore, and Susan felt a release. Not joy, not closure, but the freedom of no longer carrying the secret alone. Ryan didn't open the envelope, but he didn't push it away either. "Can we take it slow?" he asked, his voice honest. "I don't want to make this something it's not." Susan nodded, her heart aching but hopeful. "I wouldn't ask for anything else." He offered her a faint smile, then stood, gesturing to the door. "Stay for coffee? We're opening soon." She stayed, and though the truth still hung between them, it was lighter now, a thread connecting rather than binding. That afternoon, Susan made another decision. The town's whispers, Lauren's lawsuit, the viral video, they'd torn her life open, but she wouldn't let them define her. She called Clara, who clapped her hands at the idea. "A talk at the bookstore," Clara said, her voice bright. "You tell your story, Susan, and they'll listen." Ryan agreed to host it at the new page, the cozy reading nook he'd just opened, its shelves lined with classics and armchairs inviting honesty. Susan sent a message to the community group, inviting everyone, including David and Ryan. "This is my story," she wrote. "Not the rumors, not the lies. Come hear it or don't. But I'm done hiding." The night of the talk, Mitchell's Books glowed under string lights, the air thick with anticipation. Locals filled the space, their faces a mix of curiosity, sympathy, and skepticism. Clara sat in the front, her silver hair catching the light, her nod giving Susan strength. Ryan stood by the counter, his expression unreadable but present. Susan stepped to the center of the new page, a single microphone in her hand, the crowd hushing as she began. "I'm Susan Harper," she said, her voice steady, resonant. "And I've spent my life giving love, time, myself, until I disappeared. This is how I found my way back." She told them everything. The house on Maple Lane, Lauren's cruel words, the laughter that broke her. She spoke of Ellen's letter, the hospital's mistake, the son she raised and the son she lost. She admitted her past, the fling that Lauren had weaponized, and how she'd rebuilt herself through sacrifice. "I was called a maid in my own home," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "But I'm not invisible anymore. And neither are you if you've ever felt unseen." The room was silent, then erupted in applause, women wiping tears, men nodding, the town's heart beating in time with hers. David appeared at the back, his face haggard, his presence a shock. Susan faltered, but only for a moment. He stepped forward, his voice trembling as he took the microphone. "I failed her," he said, his eyes on Susan. "I let my wife hurt her, let myself forget who she was.
I'm sorry, Mom.
I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'll spend my life trying." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others skeptical. Susan met his gaze, her heart twisting but firm. "Thank you," she said simply, and let him step back. Ryan spoke next, his voice quiet but clear. "I don't know Susan well," he said, glancing at her. "But I know she's honest. She didn't have to tell me the truth, but she did. I need time, but I respect her. More than I can say." He stepped back, and Susan's eyes filled with tears, not of loss, but of hope. The talk ended with questions, stories from others, women who'd been dismissed, men who'd learned to listen. A local blogger recorded it, the video spreading beyond Willow Creek. Susan's words touching strangers who saw themselves in her fight. Days later, Susan sat in the new page, a notebook open, her pen moving. She was writing again, not just for herself, but for a memoir, a story of survival. The house on Maple Lane sold, the money funding a foundation for women starting over, women like her. David moved to a small apartment, his life humbler but honest. Lauren's empire collapsed, her parents' support gone, her posts silent. Susan didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She walked through Willow Creek now, head high, no longer a ghost. Ryan didn't call her mom, but he called her Susan, and their coffee talks grew longer, a bond built on choice, not obligation. One evening, as snow dusted the town, Susan stood in the new page, a key in her hand, Ryan's gift, a symbol of belonging. She wasn't just Ellen's niece, David's mother, or Ryan's secret. She was Susan Harper, a woman who'd given everything and taken it back, not with rage, but with truth. And in that truth, she was free. Snow dusted Willow Creek, softening the sharp edges of Main Street as December settled over the town like a quiet promise. Susan Harper stood in the new page, the reading nook Ryan had gifted her, its shelves glowing under the warm light of string bulbs. The bookstore was alive with the hum of holiday shoppers, their laughter mingling with the scent of cedar and mulled cider from a nearby table. Susan held a notebook, its pages now a tapestry of her life, grief, betrayal, awakening. She'd started calling it a memoir, though the title eluded her. Unseen felt too heavy, reclaimed too triumphant. For now, it was simply hers, a story she was writing not for fame, but for the woman she'd become. The weeks since the talk at Mitchell's Books had changed everything. Susan's words, captured on that viral video, had spread beyond Willow Creek, touching strangers who saw themselves in her fight. Her inbox overflowed with messages. Women who'd been dismissed, mothers who'd given too much, people who'd found courage in her honesty. One letter, handwritten on pale blue stationery, arrived from a woman in Cleveland. "I left my husband after 30 years because of you. I thought I was invisible, but you showed me I'm not." Susan kept it on her nightstand, next to Ellen's letter, a reminder that her pain had become a beacon. She donated half the proceeds from the Maple Lane house sale to a foundation for women starting over, a cause that felt like an extension of her soul. The check had been mailed with a note, "For the unseen, the underestimated, the unbroken." The foundation's director called, her voice thick with gratitude. But Susan didn't need thanks. Every time she stepped into the new page, saw the armchair where she'd first read Ryan's recommended memoir, felt the key in her pocket, she knew she'd already won. Not against Lauren, not against David, but for herself. Ryan was behind the counter now, wrapping a stack of novels for a customer, his glasses slipping as he laughed at something the woman said. Susan watched him, her heart full but steady. Their relationship had grown since the day she told him the truth, built on small moments. Coffee shared in the break room, debates over Austen versus Bronte, quiet confessions about their lives. He didn't call her mom, and she didn't expect him to. He called her Susan, and that was enough. But today she wanted more. Not a title, but a connection, something to anchor the thread between them. She approached him as the customer left, the bell chiming softly. "Got a minute?" she asked, her voice light but purposeful. Ryan glanced up, his smile easy. "For you? Always." They moved to the new page, settling into the armchairs, the nook quiet despite the bustle outside. Susan took a breath, her fingers brushing the notebook. "I've been writing," she said. "About everything. The house, David, you. I wanted you to know. You're in it, not as a secret, but as a gift." Ryan's eyes softened, but he didn't speak, letting her continue. "I lost a lot," she said. "But finding you, even if it's just this coffee, books, these talks, it's more than I ever hoped for. I don't need you to be my son, Ryan. I just need you to be you." He leaned forward, his voice low, deliberate. "You're in my story too, Susan. Not as a mom, not yet, maybe never, but as someone who matters. You changed how I see things. Truth, family, all of it." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, wrapped package. "For you," he said, almost shy. Susan unwrapped it, her hands trembling. Inside was a bookmark, leather-bound, embossed with a single word: courage. Her eyes filled with tears, but she laughed, the sound bright in the quiet nook. "Your trouble," she said, and he grinned, the tension dissolving. They sat there, the bookstore humming around them, and Susan felt it. A bond, not forced, not fragile, but chosen. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd held that newborn photograph, but it was better, because it was real. Back at the apartment, Susan's phone buzzed as she sipped tea, the snow falling thicker now, blanketing Willow Creek in silence. A text from David. "I got a job, Mom. Nothing big, just a start. I'm trying to be better, for you, for me. I hope you're proud, even a little." She stared at the words, her heart twisting with a familiar ache. David had moved to a small apartment on the edge of town, his life stripped of Lauren's illusions. She'd heard from Clara that he was working at the hardware store, his hands calloused, his pride humbled. Lauren was gone, her social media silent, her parents' support withdrawn. Susan didn't rejoice in their fall. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, about consequences catching up. She typed a reply, her fingers steady. "I'm glad you're trying, David. Keep going." She didn't promise forgiveness, didn't open the door wide. She'd given him everything once, but now her love came with boundaries, with respect for the woman she'd fought to become. She sent the text and set the phone down, the silence no longer punishing, but peaceful. Clara knocked on the door that evening, her arms full of gingerbread cookies shaped like stars. "For the bookstore's holiday party," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You're coming, right?" Susan laughed, pulling her into a hug. "Wouldn't miss it." The party was small, just Ryan, his staff, Clara, and a few loyal customers, but it felt like family. They sang off-key carols, swapped stories, and toasted with cider under the bookstore's twinkling lights. Susan caught Ryan's eye across the room, and he raised his glass, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey. The next morning, Susan walked through Willow Creek, the snow crunching under her boots, the town aglow with holiday lights. She passed the diner, its windows steaming with the promise of coffee and gossip. She passed the park where she'd pushed David on swings, the school where he'd graduated, the house on Maple Lane, now someone else's home. Each step was a goodbye, not to the memories, but to the weight they'd carried. She'd given everything to a family that didn't see her, And now she was giving to herself, to the woman who wrote, who loved, who stood tall. She ended at Mitchell's Books, the green storefront a beacon in the snow. Ryan was inside, arranging a display, unaware of her presence. Susan didn't go in. She stood outside, her breath fogging the air, and looked at the sign above the new page. It wasn't just a room, a key, a gift. It was her. A chapter she'd written, not with rage or tears, but with courage, with truth. She thought of the women who'd written to her, the foundation carrying her name, the son who called her Susan but saw her soul. Freedom wasn't a parade or a speech. It was this, standing in the snow, whole, unafraid, ready for whatever came next. Susan turned, her boots leaving prints in the fresh snow, and walked toward the future. She didn't need permission to start again. She never had.